Rome froze on a winter's night in 39 AD. Every family knew this was the night, not because it was cold. A person's daughter would vanish. Imagine being 14 years old, already in your nightgown, and believing that all is quiet outside your window when all of a sudden you hear the sound of armored footsteps reverberating down your street. You were raised to believe that receiving a call from the emperor was an honor. Nobody told you that it might happen suddenly. Nobody told you that the guards would enter your house as if they already owned it. Nobody gave you any warning as to why they were carrying a red cloth lamp that they intended to set in front of your door. Your mother will whisper your name to you in a few minutes, as if uttering it too loudly would enrage the gods. Your father will make an uncontrollable smile in a matter of minutes. You'll discover the reality that every noble family dreads in a matter of minutes. Daughters are claimed by the Palatine, not summoned. You're mistaken if you believe that this is where Flavia's horror starts. This moment feels merciful because of what is waiting for her inside the palace. It's not a rumor. The Garden of Venus opened on this particular night. Rome erased every evidence of this horrifying ceremony. Subscribe to Obsidian Chronicles to comprehend how a human individual could become a monster capable of devouring an entire empire by rotting from the inside out. You have to go back to the beginning, to the lineage that gave birth to him and the shadows that shook him long before Rome came to fear his name. Caligula did not emerge from insanity, he was born into greatness. And click the like button if you're interested in buried tragedies from the past. Tell me where you're watching from when you get to the part that most disturbs you. Now let's get started. Flavia is the girl who will shortly determine her fate. Keep in mind Flavio because the guy who will shortly determine her fate was shaped by what you are about to discover. The golden general of Rome, the son of Germanicus, whose mere presence had the power to subdue a legion and fire a city. The boy ought to have inherited nobility, strength, and honor. Rather, a much more caustic substance flowed inside him. His early years did not take place in tutoring halls or gardens. It took place in military camps covered in iron, sweat, and the metallic breath of battle on the untamed border of the empire. The thud of hobnail sandals made the earth tremble as he learned to move between rows of tough legionaries. The soldiers called their commander's son Caligula Little Boot because they loved seeing him in tiny armor, a loving moniker that would eventually have a much darker legacy. Even so, there was a bending of something within of him. He learned the first rule of that frontier realm. Power is acquired, not inherited, and additionally, you don't seek for forgiveness for how you use it once you've taken it. The child's soul had just begun to fracture, and it was only going to get worse. Germanicus's unexplained death was the devastating blow. The cherished youngster became a target overnight. He had no power to prevent his mother and brothers from being banished, imprisoned, and executed one by one. There was only Emperor Tiberius's icy will, no hostile army, no barbaric tribe. Then came Caligula's perverted teachings from Capri, the island where Rome thought Tiberius withdrew in peace, but where something hideous festered behind palace doors. In ways she cannot yet fathom, Flavia will pay for them. Caligula, who was hardly older than a boy, had to live next to the man who had destroyed his family. Capri was not a haven, it was a golden coffin with paranoia inside. He endured 6 torturous years under the scrutiny of an emperor who had little faith in one and murdered at random. Caligula discovered a new rule there, one much darker than the other. You have to smile at the man you wish to destroy in order to survive. He swallowed every shudder of anger, concealed every tear, and bowed to the person who had killed him. And even though he continued to act submissively on the outside, the cracks in his head grew larger until something icy and bitter emerged. Rome erupted in a frenzy of relief when Tiberius finally died in 37 AD and the Senate installed 24-year-old Caligula on the throne. A new prince, a new dawn. Germanicus's son had arrived to eradicate the decay, and he did for a brief while. He cut off despised taxes, released captives, destroyed the spies' records of Tiberius, and poured gold into the streets, games, and feasts. Rome thought it had been spared, but the man who will eventually reach for Flavia has not yet fully awakened. All his evil is doing is spreading its wings. But salvation was but a facade. because the emperor was on the verge of death due to a severe illness that struck close to the end of that first year, and something essential had not returned with him as he got out of that bed. The child no longer needed to hide anything at all after learning to conceal his despise of Capri. As Caligula stood atop the Palatine Hill and gazed down at a city that worshipped him, he finally realized a dreadful truth. When you reach the pinnacle of power, there are just victims below and no gods above you. The terrified stillness of the Senate, the applause of the people, it did not humble him. The creature Capri had crafted appeared beneath his sanity, which sloughed away like dead skin. Mania was twisted out of generosity, cruelty gave way to justice, and an idea started to solidify in the shadows of his mind. Noble-blooded women were not human, citizens, or daughters. They were tools, and waiting on a night that Flavia does not yet know would end her life is the first tool he will test. Rome was not hit by this change like a thunderstorm. Like a plague, it infiltrated the city, quiet, slow, and undetectable. A toxin that infiltrated aristocratic homes and under marble floors, eventually reaching those who thought they were the safest. And Flavia's home heard the same knock somewhere in Rome. No family dared to answer the knock, but nobody could say no. It started with a visit. That day, the emperor's heralds were not armed with swords. They brought scrolls sealed in imperial purple, a color that signified extinction or life. The demand that no parent could possibly reject was contained in those scrolls. Send the most beautiful, pure, and politically beneficial daughter, not just any daughter. It was referred to as an honor by families. They knew that wearing perfume was a death sentence. It was treasonous to reject the emperor. You were giving your child to the beast if you obeyed him. The girls were brought to the palace's private wing. Caligula gave this place the sad irony of calling it the Garden of Venus. Thinking she still had control, Flavia crossed this threshold. Before dawn, she would no longer have that illusion. It appeared to be bliss at first. Exotic fragrances, silken-lined mattresses, pink marble walls, and shadowy staff who anticipated every desire.
Thinking they had been selected for religious service, the daughters of Rome entered. But they gradually and painfully came to terms with reality. Paradise was merely an ornament. Everything underneath it was the prison. And this place's true purpose, the horror it contained, was still to come to light. Worst of all, this was just the start, because Flavia would discover that the garden did not break girls easily once her summonses arrived. It broke them gradually enough for them to comprehend each stage of their demise. They were made to wear gems, but they weren't ornaments. Each girl was identified as state property by these chains, which were made of heavy gold and felt chilly against her skin. It was worse with the transparent silks, clothing meant to reveal them and serve as a reminder that their bodies are no longer their own. Caligula removed their names first. It was risky to use real names. Identity was implied by real names. He thus substituted them with numerals, taunts, and degrading monikers that the emperor himself whispered. The Garden of Venus reinforced its hold on each identity that was torn away. However, jewelry, silk, or even fear were not the system's real weapon. It was ready, a torture that hollowed them from the inside out without causing any visible wounds or blood spills. They had no idea when the summonses would arrive. Maybe tonight. Weeks may pass before then, and every second in between was an anticipated execution. Their hearts broke with fear when they heard the echo of Praetorian sandals in the hallway. It got difficult to breathe. It became impossible to sleep. The psychological harm had already been done by the time Caligula touched them. They were prey that had been softened for the murder. When the summons finally came, it took them to the emperor's nightly theater, the feast, rather than a private chamber. The young ladies were paraded in front of the exotic creatures on show that resembled Rome's aristocracy, living ornaments, not visitors. With the haughtiness of a butcher selecting slices of meat, Caligula strolled among them. He made loud remarks about their bodies, ridiculing, applauding, ranking, and robbing them of all last dignity. However, his voice wasn't the true cruelty. The individuals who ought to have protected them were silent. Seated at tables of honor, fathers, uncles, and fiancés were compelled to nod at the emperor's obscenities, their grins appearing to be carved on. Any hint of unease or shudder of revulsion may doom them or the girl to death right now. That silence was a form of execution in and of itself. The last act then began. It's a ritual practiced like theater, not anarchy or frenzy. The shouts were muffled by soft music. Every step the victim had to make was dictated by unwritten norms, while a select group of onlookers watched in forced admiration. Caligula did not enjoy this. This was a performance, choreography, and proof that he possessed souls in addition to bodies. As Flavia stood in the light of the flame, she became aware that the emperor no longer considered her to be human. He viewed her as a place to practice brutality. Consider Flavia, a reputable consul's daughter. She still thought she may walk beside the emperor or help in rituals when she first entered the Garden of Venus. Caligula lavished her with presents, attention, and even fake tenderness during the initial days. She was disarmed by it. She became softer as a result. The trap was laid. And when it eventually broke, when the illusion crumbled and the truth showed its teeth, Flavia realized the one rule that governed this palace. A man who thinks he is a god is unstoppable. Caligula was skilled at using brutality. He alternated between acts of cruelty and pretended love, thrashing a girl one night and crying in her lap the next, while presenting gems valued at kingdoms. The mind was rewired by this emotional whiplash. The victims could no longer see him properly. Terror and hope mingled together. Violence and comfort blended together. The only person who could soothe them was the one who broke them, a dependence designed to prevent escape. But Caligula was not done. Next, he shattered solidarity. Flavia attempted to blend in with the other victims, but in the Garden of Venus, being unseen could result in death just as fast as being seen. He ranked the girls who most delighted him, who let him down, and who would be rewarded or punished. He pitted them against each other until they struggled to find any kind of protection. Each lady views the others as rivals for survival rather than friends. Unity died, and all belonged to the emperor after unity died. And furthermore, he did not release her when he grew weary of one of them. He sold her. Senators and generals have access to broken young women through clandestine alternatives within the palace walls. The same men who ruled Rome during the day. Caligula made them participate by applying the same filth to their hands as he did to his own. The shared guilt is the strongest leash. The elite of the empire now were bound to him by their silence. But the humiliation didn't end there. Families were told to express gratitude.
A few fathers were compelled to throw festive feasts following the defilement of their daughters. They toasted the honor of their kid while ingesting their terror like poison. Within the Palatine, appreciation turned into another word signifying hopelessness. And despite everything, the surveillance tightened like a noose. No corner was secure. Spies, slaves, guards, there are eyes everywhere. In the middle of the night, even one muffled cry could be described as an uprising. Within the Venus's paradise, layer after layer of humanity was reduced to nothing. All that was left was flesh, terror, and the echo of approaching footsteps. By 40 and 41 AD, the ambiance of the palace had turned into poisonous enough to suffocate. The females who once showed up with gentle eyes and sweet voices had become skeleton ghosts floating along the hallways. Many completely stopped talking. Some ceased to reply. Their thoughts withdrew, taking refuge in the last area that Caligula was unable to access. Physicians observed disconnection. In order to survive, souls separate from bodies. However, the reality that the court made every effort to conceal was much more sinister. Suicides had started, and they didn't stop once they started. While some females shattered, others broke. Flavia, somewhere in the middle, she got captured. Too broken to live, too scared to die. 6 confirmed suicides were mentioned in whispers among the servants. However, everyone knew the reality. The only number the palace was unable to conceal was 6. Imperial quiet and marble flooring concealed the true count. And Flavia started to question whether surviving was indeed the worst result. The only horizon that provided comfort was death, which previously had been their greatest fear. In a world when they had nothing else, it was their last act of sovereign independence. Not even their own names. Some used pieces of broken vases to cut their veins. Some made nooses out of the silk strips they tore from their opulent gowns. Others just ascended the balconies and descended, allowing gravity to show them the kindness their monarch would never have. Caligula's touch was harsher on these females than the icy embrace of death. The emperor, however, was not content. He created a new form of brutality in his idea of godhood, a torture so twisted that the victims were attacked by those they cared about. He permitted parents to see their daughters, not to save them, not to console them, but to observe their suffering. To cover up their bruises, the girls were painted, scented, and clothed in silks. They were coerced to acting, lying, and smiling. Their anguish was hidden under trembling lips and makeup, and the parents had to act as if this was a celebration in front of centurions. A mother was put to death if her voice broke. A daughter's family suffered if she ventured to reveal her identity. The creator of their torment watched with glee as everyone was imprisoned in a hideous theater and forced to swallow their pain. However, Caligula committed the one error that all despots inevitably do. The guys who carried the swords were degraded by him. It wasn't enough to destroy women. He needed to emasculate the pillars of Rome itself. He hauled senators to witness the mistreatment of their spouses. In front of their own soldiers, he denigrated Praetorian Guard commanders by making fun of them. He made honorable soldiers say obscene passwords that were meant to humiliate them. One of those troops was a man whose allegiance had previously been unwavering. Cassius Chaerea was a devoted servant of Germanicus and a veteran soldier. Caligula never stopped making fun of him. The emperor believed that he was untouchable. He thought that no blade would ever dare come up against him. He was mistaken. The hatred of the conspirators and Chaerea changed into something non-political. It turned into survival. Once a practical instrument, Caligula had spread throughout the Roman Empire like a cancerous tumor, and the strain ultimately erupted in January 41 AD. Caligula departed to take a bath during the Palatine Games via the Cryptoporticus, a private underground passage. Thinking he was immortal, he stepped inside the dim stone passageway. He did not prepare to survive. His progress was obstructed by Chaerea and the conspirators. Steel was all that was present. No warning, no trial, and no words. The guy who had insisted on being worshipped as a god was silenced after the first blow. A blade to the neck broke his larynx. His sobs were muffled by a torrent of his own blood. The hysteria then started. He was stabbed more than 30 times. As the terrified mortal he really was, the self-proclaimed Jupiter of Rome collapsed to the ground, writhing, pleading, and dying. In a pool of blood, his life came to an end. His twisted face was marked with humiliation. But the horror had not ended. The young women were confined within the Garden of Venus just a few meters away. They heard the shouts, the metal clashing, the thunder of rushing feet, and the tumult. They crouched in corners, trembling, not knowing if this was a sign of salvation or another kind of disaster. Then there was stillness. Not the oppressive, crushing silence, but the strange, empty silence of a world where the monster had suddenly vanished. None of them, however, dared to move, because they had a horrifyingly clear understanding of one thing after spending years in that palace. Anything worse usually starts when anything ends in Rome. They had good reason to be afraid. There was no bright dawn after Caligula's death. It created a gap. Once his German bodyguards realized their emperor was dead, they were enraged. In a matter of minutes, the palace was converted into an abattoir. They killed officials, servants, and anyone unlucky enough to come into contact with them. The Garden of Venus turned into a deadly trap for the young ladies. Some ran barefoot through halls covered in bodies and broken glass. Others, immobilized by years of indoctrination, locked themselves in their rooms and clung to one another in the dark, waiting to see if the next person to knock on the door would kill them or set them free. When the blood haze finally lifted a few hours later, an unusual figure came out of hiding. Caligula's trembling uncle Claudius was hauled out from behind a curtain and placed on the imperial throne.
Always the survivor, Claudius had to confront an unthinkable reality. Rome might fall apart if it discovered what had transpired in the Garden of Venus, including the system, the collaboration, and the involvement of the noble family. He therefore came to a choice, a much more practical but darker choice than remaining silent. Rome's answer did not satisfy the Garden of Venus survivors. It was payment. A chilly transaction intended to stifle the truth before it had a chance to breathe. The young ladies were sent back to their families by the palace wearing costly clothing, covered in gold, and carrying dowries big enough to silence a whole city. However, the same unwritten order was carried by each coin. Ignore it. Ignore what transpired. Don't remember who did it. Ignore the daughters. A god who wasn't a god at all was fed by Rome. There were no trials. There was no punishment for accomplices. Rome merely covered the reality with layers of official reticence and folded it into the shadows. The girls went back to their villas. However, the individuals that returned home were not the ones who departed. They were walking corpses, shells, breathing bodies, but souls that had perished on the Palatine Hill and were never allowed to come back. A noble woman's value in the harsh Roman society was determined by her chastity. Even though these girls were victims, they were crushed by a system that they were unable to oppose. Like a curse, the stain followed them. Truth, compassion, and their own lives were subordinated to family honor. The majority never got married. The majority did not survive. Only the servants who left food at their doors could see them, hidden inside chambers and far-off wings of their estates, like humiliating antiques. Their trauma developed in excruciating, recurring patterns. Panic was sparked by a hand on their shoulder. They collapsed in terror at a sudden noise. Nightmares so intense that they woke up screaming every night were spurred on by sleep. The period of physical imprisonment was over. However, there were no guards to murder, no emperor to depose, and no key to open the mental prison. Freedom was not a victory for them. They were sentenced to a lifetime of exile within their own bodies. Rome turned her head away. Rome avoided eye contact at all times. It was simpler to place the blame on the women than to face its own corruption. It is simpler to conceal a crime than to face the decaying basis of a civilization. Because there was never just one man under Caligula's reign. It was about the system that created him, provided for him, shielded him, and made the Garden of Venus possible in the first place. The specifics, whether Suetonius embellished, whether competing dynasties exaggerated his brutality, could all be disputed by historians in the future. However, the convergence of sources unquestionably indicates one thing. There was a machine of cruelty. A device designed to sate the worst desires of one man. Rome also permitted it to function covertly. This was hardly a singular horror, it was a defect in the basic structure of the empire. A single man had all of Rome's authority, legislative, judicial, military, and even divine. If the wrong man ascended to the throne, there would be no checks, no boundaries, and no way out. Caligula demonstrated how blurry the boundaries are between order and anarchy, between ruler and monster, between civilization and savagery. The bodies of the anonymous girls who perished in the Garden of Venus were used to create that line, rather than marble. Rome created marvels that have endured for millennia, such as aqueducts, arenas, and legal codes.
However, it failed to fulfill the most basic obligation of any society, which is to protect its weakest members from the predators at the top. These women's story is more than just a tragic historical event. It is a cautionary tale that reverberates through time. Even if a country achieves great power, its legacy would be inscribed in humiliation rather than glory if it compromises human dignity in the process. The winners frequently impact history. However, shadows manage to endure. The names were erased, the messages were scentless, and the tears turned into silk cushions. They continued to exist on the periphery that Rome attempted to eradicate, and now they are ours. Because evil does not always reveal itself with swords and fire, we must choose centuries later to observe those shadows or repeat them. Evil can wear a crown at times. Evil can occasionally be concealed by quiet. Evil can also flourish when too many people choose not to express their outrage. Let this narrative unnerve you if it did. Let it enrage you if it did. And if it made you think about the price of unbridled authority, then the voices that Rome attempted to silence have at last been heard.